Welcome to this event on this bright morning here in Washington, D.C. We welcome you from wherever you're tuning in. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion today on upward mobilities and cities after 2020. Looking forward to this discussion. We've got three very distinguished urbanists and writers to walk us through what's really kind of a fascinating bit of research that they've all been working on. And then we'll have a discussion about sort of what's going on in America's metropolitan areas today, particularly in the midst of this COVID pandemic, but also looking at what sorts of things have created the situation that our cities are in now and what that suggests for policy makers going forward. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Charles Blaine, Wendell Cox, and Joel Kotkin, whose bios are on our events page and whose reputations are already well established, I'm sure, to many of you who are tuning in. We're going to talk a little bit about the sort of disjunction, as I would call it, between the rhetoric of many of our urban leaders and then the actual actions that they take to deal with things like inequality and mobility and poverty in our cities. Try to find out a little bit about which cities are doing a good job as opposed to those who are not, and what that actually means for policy. So we're going to look at how we got to where we are. We're going to look at what we think some of these conditions that our cities are in mean for the future and for metropolitan policy making more generally. So I don't want to take up too much of the time here. What we will do is turn this over first to Joel Kotkin so he can walk us through some recent findings, and then we'll turn it over to Wendell and Charles as well for their comments. Before we get into our discussion, I just want to make everyone know that, or let everybody know that at the towards the end of our time together today, we will take questions from our viewers. And if you have a question at any time during this presentation, to get in the queue, there are two ways you can send your questions in. One is to email them to kawit@AEI, and that is KAWIT period PROMRAT @AEI.org. Or on Twitter, you can send questions to hashtag #CitiesPost2020. That's cities and then post, POST 2020. So if you have questions, please do send them along. We'll get you in the queue. And then a little bit later on in our discussion, we'll open it up for those questions and try to get as many covered as we can. So I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to turn this over to Joel Kotkin, who will start us off by going through a few slides and explaining a little bit about what went into some of this research that he and the others have put together on mobility. So Joel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Basically, what we wanted to ask was the question that doesn't get asked, even in the midst of all the reaction to the Floyd incident and things happened this year. People talk about intent. That seems to be what our progressive leaders are generally doing in this thing. Well, we believe in equality. We believe in upward mobility. We believe in economic justice. All laudable ideas. But the problem is, in reality, many of those same cities are cities where minorities are leaving, minority incomes are low, and poverty is most intense. So we have to begin to ask ourselves, and I think this is a question, I think, for the new administration coming in, which will be, okay, you've talked a good game, but what about the reality? What we're trying to point out, not necessarily that we have every solution, but that certainly what's being done now is not working and needs to be changed. So maybe if we could take a look at a few of the findings, and then I'm going to turn it over a little bit to Wendell. One of the things we found that was really interesting is that, for the most part, the big exception being Washington, D.C., which has always been a place with higher wages and has been in recent decades a place where we're talking about the region, not necessarily the city of Washington, has been the one what you might call blue progressive region that has done better for African Americans. But even there, the best results are in Atlanta, Virginia Beach, Oklahoma City, Raleigh, Phoenix, Richmond, Austin, Kansas City, Nashville. Now, remember, the core cities tend to be blue even in these places, but the regions tend to be more either purple or red. And they seem to have done much better. And we're looking at basic things like income. If you adjust for cost of living and taxes and things like that, the incomes are much, much higher in many places, let's say like Atlanta, than they are in places like San Jose, Chicago, Providence, New Orleans, San Diego, Milwaukee, and of course, Los Angeles, which is the Los Angeles area, which I live in, and San Francisco. I mean, there's such an out migration in both places, but somebody even made a movie, The Last Black Man in San Francisco. I mean, I remember there being a vital African American community in San Francisco. It's almost extinct. One of the great ironies is the cities that have been most radicalized, notably like Portland and Seattle, are actually cities where the African American population has been dropping and where the results for African Americans are not particularly good. Now, this is not just unique to the African American community. If we go to the next slide, we see a very similar pattern with Latinos. Can we get the next slide? Hello? Okay, here we are. Great. Amazingly similar, same cities. And as Wendell will discuss, a lot of this has to do with the cost of housing and rents, which are a big problem. And again, the upward mobility is very low. And again, Los Angeles, San Francisco, cities that are run by very aggressively progressive regimes, New York, even more so, all actually doing fairly badly for the Hispanic population. Hispanics are probably the key group shaping the American future in the next 20 or 30 years. And they're moving in large numbers, not just to the cities that are seen in green, but also to smaller cities. That's one of the things that we've seen is communities that were once had almost no Hispanics now are becoming heavily Hispanic. One area that Wendell and I've done quite a bit of work in is the Northwest Arkansas area, which has been an area where Latinos and other minorities have done well, and it's now 16% Hispanic. So, I mean, we're really seeing a reshaping of the country, and I think it's not a negative so much as I think Hispanics as well as African Americans are looking for opportunity. That's what America is about. You know, if you don't like things where you are, you go someplace else, and that's what's happening. But then we have to ask the policy question: why are they moving, and what policy environment works best for minorities? And then we go to the last slide in this series. Again, very similar. Asians basically have higher incomes than white non-Hispanics, but again, very similar things. Atlanta, St. Louis, Kansas City. These are cities you don't necessarily assume have large Asian communities, but they now do. I was thinking about Nashville. Last time I was in Nashville, I was taken around to Little Mexico, Little Kurdistan, Little Somalia, a Little Vietnam. So, in other words, these communities are different, and and they're even in small communities. You know, these lists are the major metros, but I was in Fargo, North Dakota, with my youngest daughter, and she wanted ice cream. This is last summer, you know, when we could still travel, and we wanted ice cream, and we ended up in a Thai ice cream parlor, and we were the only non-Asians there. And who would have ever expected to see that in Fargo, North Dakota? So, I mean, I think people are voting with their feet, and I think that this, you know, gives us a chance to reorient ourselves in terms of what kind of policies work for minorities, and, you know, frankly, policies that help, you know, people who run, you know, grievance programs at universities and things that help the average Hispanic, African American, or Asian are really two different things, and we have to start thinking about that. So now I'd like to turn this over to Wendell. We'll go through a couple of slides. Got to unmute yourself.
Great, thanks, Joel.
Okay.
Wendell, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we have been following the COVID death rates by around the country for some months now, and this is very important with respect to this whole upward mobility issue. We wanted to deal with that as well. Our approach is a little bit different. What we've done, because the best data, the best national data, disaggregated national data is at the county level. It's really not available below that level. A lot of people try to look at density in counties. Problem with densities is you've got one county out in California that is about as large as Costa Rica, and you've got the smallest county in this country is Manhattan. I mean, densities don't make sense unless you limit it to urban density. So what we did is we went through the whole of the 3,000 counties and basically looked at COVID death rates per 1,000 people based upon urban densities. And you see that the counties that have urban densities below 5,000 have essentially below national average COVID death rates. And it doesn't matter about the recent surges. They've made very little difference at all in these death rates. But as you get to the more densely populated counties, most of which, the biggest of which, of course, are in the New York City area, you find the rates going up very high. So that's something very important. Now, that isn't to say that living next to one another means you've got a greater chance of getting COVID. However, the problem with high density is lifestyles. We end up spending more time in enclosed spaces that are insufficiently ventilated. We spend more time on transit. We spend more time in elevators. We go into buildings where windows don't open and sit in offices that are overcrowded. So it's those kinds of sort of secondary impacts of density that are driving this, combined with, of course, overcrowded housing and so on. And it's what we'd like to do is talk about exposure density, which is a concept out of radiology, which basically says, let's look at how much time you've spent being exposed to X-rays. Well, what we're basically saying is the key here with respect to density and COVID is exposure density. How much time are you spending in environments that are threatening? Next slide, please. One of the big questions that comes up about upward mobility is what is there we can do or what is really driving limits on upward mobility? And really, the critical issue, as we say in the report, is housing. If you look at what's happened in this country in the last 50 years, where the cost of living differences between areas of the country, except for Manhattan, were very small 50 years ago, in the intervening time, and especially in the last 20 years, we've seen the cost of living go up much higher in a lot of cities, especially in California, but also Portland, Denver, Seattle, Miami, and so on. And what we did in this report was to basically say, well, let's look at these more costly metropolitan areas and combine their costs based upon Bureau of Economic Analysis data to try to figure out where is the difference in the cost of living between the average and the high cost cities or metropolitan areas. And you can see that about 88% of the difference in the cost of living is in housing. So that, for example, some people like to say, well, when we look at housing affordability, we need to throw in transportation because as people move farther out, their transportation costs increases. Well, not really. Not when you consider how dispersed we are at this point and the fact that 10% or less of the jobs are downtown. This is really crucial. So it's important to understand that if we want people to be upwardly mobile, we had better get on to housing affordability, and we haven't yet. That'll do it for me.
Okay, thanks, Joel and Wendell. Appreciate that very much. Before I open this up just for a more general discussion, and I do want to bring you in, Charles, here in a minute. I wonder first if you could just lay out for the audience how you actually measured mobility for the sake of this latest report that you've done. I don't know if Wendell, you want to take that, or
Sure,
Joel. There's obviously different definitions of upward mobility, and you have a kind of a unique formulation, I think, in this report.
Well,
so to help kind of make sense of those slides we saw earlier.
Right. Okay. Well, what we did is we developed an index with about, I think, 12 indicators. We divided them into two basic categories. One was overall metropolitan, because there's some issues that really there's no data on the ethnicity, but they were issues like, let's see, how large is the labor market in terms of jobs? how many jobs can you get to in 30 minutes? That's sort of a mobility issue. How much does it cost to move from renting to owning? That's a crucial issue. And you see that showing up particularly in the California cities as being a problem. What is the top of the lowest income quintile in the metropolitan area? And that's an attempt to get at equality rather than using the Gini coefficient that nobody understands except for economists. And then net domestic migration, and we looked at that over the last 20 years. Now, with respect to the three minority groups we looked at, or minority and racial groups, which were Asians, Hispanics, and African Americans, we looked at median household income adjusted for the standard of the cost of living index, housing affordability using the median multiple, which is the median house income, house price divided by the median household income, unemployment rate, education, and a very important one, change in the number of households over the last 20 years. And the reason we had to use that is because there's no good migration data below the total number. And so we looked at household change, and there we see all sorts of things like the suburbs of Chicago seeming to empty out into Atlanta, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay, thanks very much for that. I want to come back a little bit to some of the things that Joel started talking about in his remarks about cities that are actually attracting people and why that is. But before we do that, I really do want to drill down a little bit just on this issue of how our cities got to be where they are. And Charles, I'm wondering if you could weigh in here a little bit to talk a little bit about how is it that places that used to be economically and socially diverse as cities and as metropolitan areas have grown to become essentially very exclusive enclaves that begin to see out migration. It hasn't always been that way. So what kinds of decisions have policymakers, leaders, and other interests been making over the last few decades that have gotten us to where we are?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a combination of things. One of the things following a lot of city councils and county governments and other local governments that you see is that sitting in these meetings day in and day out, you have a lot of activists and folks who aren't genuinely from communities that are impacted by the policies that these councils and these bodies are passing. So a lot of times it goes back to what Joel says, is that they're passing policies that are completely out of step with the needs of the communities. And it's because the communities aren't there advocating for the things that they need. Joel mentioned that, this conversation within our group accelerated around the time of George Floyd. And, one of the things that kind of just popped up across this country was just this growing demand from local citizens about the desire for reform on the local level. And what they got in many cities here in Texas and Austin and Dallas, they got this kind of movement to defund the police, which is completely out of line with what they were asking for and with what they needed, because that's going to harm their communities more. And I think it's the same thing when you look at housing. You have a lot of local officials who constantly talking about housing affordability and talk about how they want to make these cities more inclusive and make sure people can move back in and afford whatever type of housing they want. Yet these are the same officials who are passing things like impact fees and height requirement ordinances, like here in Houston, or hookup fees, environmental surveys, all of these things, delaying the permitting processes so to increase costs and slow down development. And so it's completely out of step with what a lot of these folks are asking for. And there hasn't been a connection, I think, that is our Texas controller, Glenn Hager, tries to draw this connection to the regulations passed by these cities and these major metro areas and the cost of living increases and housing increases that we're seeing. And they saw that 25% of the cost of a single family home can be directly associated to some of these regulations. But I don't think people often, certainly not on the local level, make those connections. And I think even, going beyond that, when you talk about rental rates and the need to draw those connections to rental rates as well, because that ties into it. So I think it's been kind of this confusion or just this lack of information that has kind of trickled through, allowing people to understand that these policies that are happening on the local level are happening because the communities that need the help are not there advocating for them. They're being represented by people who don't know their interests, and this is what we end up with.
And it seems like this is more of a kind of an ideological phenomenon than just a kind of a blunt partisan political phenomenon, right? I mean, certainly our cities, when it comes to governance and leadership, have grown more politically monochrome over the last 30 years or so. I mean, if you look back at the 20 largest kind of metro areas in the core city there, like in the mid 90s, you had a pretty nice mix of sort of Republican and Democratic mayors. When you fast forward to today, that's really shifted. And yet a lot of the cities on the top tier in the slides that Joel was talking about or showing us earlier are certainly governed by Democratic city councils and Democratic mayors. And so it seems like we're not really dealing so much with political interests as we are certain ideological interests. There seems to be a big difference between those cities that are being run well and those that aren't. And this is a question not just for you, Charles, but for Joel and Wendell as well, whoever kind of wants to take it. What are the chief ideological drivers here? Because I'm sure if you go to some of these cities in California that we've referenced, or some of the other places that have seen a lot of outmigration, the leaders certainly aren't going to say, well, we've been trying to keep poor people out of here. We've been trying to reduce the share of minorities. They're not going to say that. And I'd be interested when it comes to this kind of NIMBY impulse, like what you see as driving it. Is it purely the strength of other interests, like environmental interests are just so strong in these places? Or is there something about class that we need to talk about that people are much less comfortable talking about?
Well,
I see you trying to speak there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
My view is that there really isn't an intention to keep minorities out. I really don't think that's what these people have in mind. I do think that they really would like to improve things, but they don't understand. And they have departments in their communities. And by the way, where the biggest problems are, city councils have become less important. Things are now determined at the regional basis, where land use policy and housing affordability issues are made by metropolitan planning organizations and regional and state organizations, so that, where we have retained local zoning and not turned it over to metropolitan or state organizations, you're going to find cities that have lower costs of living. So yes, indeed, there is a problem with progressive cities that talk a good game and don't deliver. I have no idea why people don't understand what goes wrong here. But the biggest problem is when you allow that to be taken over at the metropolitan or state level, and you get a situation like in California, where when we apply housing costs to the poverty rate, you get an increase of 2.3 million people in poverty in California relative to the national rate. Big number for a state with only 40 million people.
Yeah, I would just add a little bit on the ideology question that Ryan brought up. First of all, I mean, we have to understand, and I think this is reflective of what Charles was talking about. Let's say you have something like, Black Lives Matter, and when you look at the issue of police reform, I think that's a legitimate issue. I mean, there are obviously abuses that need to be addressed, but look into who Black Lives Matter is. What is their ideology? And they are driven by very much a sort of Marxist, and I would say a bastardized Marxist view, very much an ideology that's very Manichaean. You're either a racist or you're an anti-racist. If you don't buy our sort of smorgasbord of views, which also aren't favorable to things like nuclear families, then you are a racist. And so so part of the problem is nobody seems to be focused on the effects. I know talking to Charles that, like, when people talk about defunding the police, well, that probably is very attractive in the faculty lounge at Rice University. Probably not so popular in the first and third wards, where people are worried about their security. So what happens is, because the message is filtered through the media itself has its own biases, so you don't ever get to what's going on. I mean, like my good friend Fred Siegel's talk about the riot ideology and the idea, well, if we riot, then we'll get all this attention. Well, I happen to have watched and written about and observed the 1992 civil disorders in Los Angeles. And yes, right afterwards, there was every company said, we're going to help. Over time, the investment went down, and the community became even poorer relative to everyone else. So what you have are very different agendas. If you're a grievance study professor at a local college, your priorities are very different than the person who lives in the neighborhood.
And if I can just add something to that, I mean, I think Joel's exactly right about the way that it's filtered through. We had this issue here in Houston where a few years ago they wanted to build an affordable housing building in this area of Tanglewood, which is an upper middle income area of town. And the mayor, a Democrat, stopped it. And the activist called him a segregationist. I mean, this black Democrat mayor was called a segregationist for stopping it rather than listening to the reasons for why he stopped it. And his arguments were, it's not close to the job centers for the folks who would live there. So they're going to have a difficulty of getting to and from jobs. The public transportation lines weren't great over there. The school that was in the immediate vicinity was already at capacity. So all these other issues that built into that, they completely disregarded and just kind of went with the narrative that he was a segregationist because he didn't want, quote unquote, those people living in this area when there were other reasons for that. And I think the same thing with the defund the police movement. I mean, Houston has been one of the cities that hasn't given into that, and he's taken a lot of heat for that. And while I disagree with him on a lot of issues, I think there's this notion nowadays that you're good or you're bad, and there's no in between. And if you're not on that side, well, then there's a problem, rather than looking at the kind of the issues that build into all of this and got us to where we are today.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and Charles, if I could follow up on that too, I'm curious, you got into this a little bit in some of your earlier remarks. I'm just wondering, when it comes down to kind of practical brass tacks, when these kind of ideological sort of phenomena manifest themselves in terms of actual over-regulation on the ground, are there some examples that you can get into of just the kinds of things that city leaders are actually doing right now to essentially over-regulate the city that it then results in the kind of problems we've been discussing?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many. I mean, I know that there's often the talk about food trucks and how they're banned in a lot, or increasingly regulated in a lot of cities. I mean, that's something we saw here, and there was a local fight. I mean, in a number of cities across Texas. It's an alternative to a brick and mortar restaurant. It allows it's a low barrier entry. Great opportunity for upward mobility for someone who has not a lot of money for startup costs for a business, and yet they were regulating it and driving up the permitting costs so that people were kept out of it. I mean, similar, and not similarly, but in a different instance, we have a city, Manville, that's about maybe 20, 30 miles west of Houston, that recently banned dollar stores, convenience stores, and other small box stores, as well as gas stations. And the reason that they did this is because they said they have a lot of low income residents, and by allowing for more of these stores, it would somehow keep them low income. And so their idea was that they ban these, then they can lure a massive grocery store that could then bring 200 jobs and provide better services and contribute to the community. But in the meantime, they're prohibiting these jobs from coming for their residents, and they're forcing their residents to go outside of the town to try to find access to fresh food and things like that, when they could have had these opportunities there. And so we're seeing these things pop up. I know that this banning of dollar stores and small box convenience stores is actually happening in Oklahoma as well, and a few other. I think Fort Worth here in Texas tried to do that, and they're all doing it under the guise of trying to protect low income residents, when really what they're doing is just limiting opportunities. And kind of on the flip side, what we're seeing in a lot of cities across the country is, to try to alleviate poverty and to try to spur upward mobility, a lot of cities are starting to do this guaranteed basic income. I'm not sure if you guys have seen that, but I think we're at about 20 cities now that have signed on to this Mayors for Guaranteed Basic Income coalition to start giving out $1,500 to $2,500 to residents on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, so that they can kind of, afford increased rental rates or afford food or whatever other expenses they have. But the problem is, I mean, there are a lot of problems with it, but I think one of the issues that they don't look at is that most of the cost of living, the drivers of the cost of living, is what these governments are doing. And so no matter how much your guaranteed income is going to be, you're never going to keep that pace with the increase of cost of living. And so if you just address the underlying issues, you wouldn't have to do this. And so I know that's been implemented in Stockton. I think 4 or 5 California cities have either implemented it or created a commission to look at it. Richmond, Virginia recently said they were looking at it. Shreveport, Louisiana, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, all these cities are looking at this rather than looking at the underlying reason. So they're just kind of using government as another crutch to try to alleviate these issues rather than addressing the actual issues.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on Charles's point, which is, I think the idea of giving more income to poorer people is fine, but I think it should be in the context of work. And I think that, and one of the reasons that many progressives don't like the universal basic income, then nobody calls them on the fact they're not creating jobs. I mean, there are, I mean, it would be, to me, infinitely better if somebody gets a job at Home Depot, makes $15 an hour, and then we could have a tax system. I think Milton Friedman talked about a negative income tax, but let's encourage people to work. I mean, when I talk to people in minority communities, and I have a lot of exposure here, obviously, to Asian and Latinos communities here in California, in the county of Orange, even. One of the things that you find is that they like they're proud of working, they like working, and I think what you almost have is a desire. We're going to give up on providing good blue collar entry level jobs that people need. We're just going to pay them, and then I guess either we'll have robots, or we'll bring in cheap labor from abroad and not have to give people good jobs. I think about one of the great mayors of recent history. Well, one was Bob Lanier, a Democrat, and Henry Cisneros, who we've worked with quite a bit, former mayor of San Antonio. When Henry was able to bring Toyota to San Antonio, that was a game changer.
That's right.
And I keep wondering, like, if Elon Musk was building his truck plant in South LA or Fresno, what an enormously positive thing. And what bothers me the most is, and I think this is partially reflective from the environmental movement, is that basically, if you're not a coder working for Google, your job isn't worth anything. And the dignity of work, the idea that people should be self-sufficient, that want to be self-sufficient. And I think that desire is still there. And I think it's actually quite strong among the next, the Zs, the kids coming up. I just think that we're really shortchanging people, and we're not saying, look, it's a problem if we don't have these entry-level jobs, particularly ones that pay reasonably well. There was just an industrial development in New York City that was shot down by the progressives because it wasn't good enough. I think that really minority communities in particular are going to have to start saying, why aren't there good jobs being produced here, and why aren't they coming? Why did Musk not go to South LA but had to go to the outer suburbs of Austin for his new plant? Those are huge losses and tremendous opportunities. When I worked in San Antonio, I remember doing interviews with people for whom these jobs were the beginning of their move into the middle class. And that's what Urban Reform Institute's all about. It's what our work is about. And if in America, if minorities or other people don't feel there's going to be upward mobility, and and their only hope is to get money from the state, I don't blame them to voting for Bernie Sanders and AOC, because capitalism isn't offering them what they should be offered.
And I can just add one more thing to the question about what some of these cities are doing. It's another thing that we've seen here a lot is just the delays. We talked about permitting for development, but delays in kind of just business permits as well, right, for folks who want to start businesses. There is this guy here who showed up to city council, I think 3 or 4 weeks in a row, almost in tears, because he started a construction company. He was a veteran and was applying for a veteran-owned business permit from the city of Houston, and they just would not process it. And there were just excuse after excuse after excuse of why it was delayed. And he's bringing in paperwork showing that he could be a subcontractor on $1 million projects, and he's losing out on money and a solid chunk of money for his business simply because he could not get the permitting through. And these stories are, they're heard left and right, or the banning of home-based businesses for folks who want to start something who, again, can't afford brick and mortar and need a low startup cost so they can have a reduced barrier entry. So a lot of these things, I mean, they're simple fixes, but for some reason there's just been this massive disconnect between what these communities need and what they want and what these officials are passing. And I think it's often because they think they know better than what the actual community wants.
Yeah, well said. Thanks. Well, I'd like to turn a little bit towards this question of the cities that are basically doing things the right way, or mostly so, the places where people are relocating, kind of what those attributes are. Before we get into that, though, I just want to remind viewers that if you have a question, you can go ahead and send those in to get queued up for the time we can start doing a Q&A. Again, you can email questions to kawitpromrat@aei.org, kawit.promrat@aei.org, or on Twitter, hashtag citiespost2020. So feel free to send those in and we'll get them queued up. What I'm curious to know if the attributes of the cities where it seems like people want to be, where middle-class people still feel like they can get ahead, and where those that are moving, where they're moving to. Some of those that were on the slide with the green bars, Joel, that you walked through earlier. If you had to make a list of characteristics of these places that could be a guide to policymakers, and we can talk a little bit more practically in a few minutes about what actual policy changes might look like. We've kind of been touching on some of those. I'm wondering if we could, if we had to make that list of 5, 7, 10 sort of attributes, what they would be, and particularly with an eye to, what would need to happen if working class and middle class families were to become kind of vibrant parts of these metro areas as they have been in the past. I look
Well,
at.
I think there.
Go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, I think there are some basic things that we find. First of all, there's distinctions even within a metro between the often the center and the periphery. What's happening, for instance, in Houston, and Charles could hopefully back me up on this, and certainly in Dallas, is although the cities may have some restrictions, it's the economy is much more open in some of the suburban areas. Also, because development has been allowed, prices both in the city and the suburbs are lower. So, for instance, if you say like we have in California, well, we're not going to develop in the periphery, everything's got to be in the inner city. Well, you don't have to be Milton Friedman to figure out that if I have real estate in the inner city, I can boost the price of that real estate because people don't have any option. So a second thing is clearly on the environmental issues. One of the things is that if you take a state like California, our government has decided, well, if you have to drive to work, it's bad. Well, since 95% of people in California drive to work, and the only real alternative is working at home, this is an insane way of doing things, and you're just driving the costs up higher and higher and higher. What's astounding is that you have policies that are directed towards density and transit at a time when both people are rejecting density, they're moving to less dense areas, and they're not taking transit. So the problem is that these are policy choices that are made. Now, in some regions, it's very, very oppressive. In other regions, it's not so. There are, like if you take a place like North Dallas, there are communities that want to stay very bucolic, and other ones that want to build up. I mean, there are essentially new cities being built in places like the Woodlands and Addison, Texas, and parts of around Phoenix, or a new city being built outside of Denver. This is kind of what we really need to do. And the fact that we keep having policies that's trying to force everything into places where the real estate is already expensive, it's very overregulated and congested, is a disaster, particularly given what's happening after COVID.
Yeah, one of the things I think that's important, oftentimes I'm asked by people overseas, what's the key to the fact that Atlanta does so well, or DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth, or Houston does so well? And the key isn't that there are smart people at the top of those urban areas that have selected policies. The key is an idea that basically says we're going to allow things to go on here. We're not going to overregulate. We're going to make sure we have a good environment. We're going to try to have low taxes. I mean, look at where people are moving in this country. Huge migrations to Florida, Tennessee, and Texas, all without income taxes. So it really is a whole environment, and that's really what's being missed. All of the metropolitan areas that are more friendly toward minorities have low housing prices, low costs of living, and so on. And that's why people are moving there. And it's an amazing thing when you consider how much nicer could it be in the world than to live in Southern California within 10 miles of the beach. Yet people are leaving. 2.5 million people have left California net and moved to the rest of the country in the last 20 years. And they're moving to places like Nashville and Jacksonville and Atlanta and Dallas, Fort Worth.
And just to follow on Wendell's point about taxes, I mean, property taxes is another major one here. And in Harris County, for instance, you can live in the city of Houston or in the city of Westview, which is a city that's within Houston but has a higher tax rate. And if you cross the street, you could live in, say, unincorporated Harris County and not pay the city property taxes, not pay the garbage fees, not pay HISD Houston Independent School District property taxes, and your cost of living can significantly decrease if you just move across the street or move, further out. And then you're also not dealing with the aspect of crime that we have here in the city of Houston. We're at a 20-year high. Unincorporated areas of Harris County aren't seeing that. They have better response times because they use the county sheriff and the constable protection. And so it's a completely different world when you just move maybe a few blocks away. And so a lot of people who are, the city of Houston's population, and I'm assuming it's probably the same for Austin, Dallas, and a lot of major other cities, has stayed relatively stagnant in recent years, but the county is what's been growing, and even more so the other counties, Fort Bend County, Waller County, Montgomery County, the counties surrounding it have been increasing in population as well. But I think that it's such a subtle distinction, but you can kind of move across the street and have such a different life, and I think it's an intriguing thing for a lot of people.
So these are good thoughts. One thing that I'm wondering about, though, is what would you say to the critic who would push back and say, it sounds like you're saying, on the one hand, you should make more flexible the ability to provide more housing. You should relax land use rules. You should underregulate rather than overregulate so that you can produce more housing. But on the other hand, you're also saying that this preoccupation with density is creating problems for us as well. But in some cities, if you're thinking about what a mayor's possible options are, isn't increasing density sort of consistent with the idea of allowing more housing to be built?
Yes, it is, but there's no market for it. The market for creating density is very, very small. And the real big problem is that I recognize, if you're going to try to create a higher density in Manhattan, it's going to be difficult because there's not much open land. However, if you allow peripheral development on the city of New York going out into Suffolk County and up north to Poughkeepsie and so on, you're going to actually lower in the long run land costs and lower the costs throughout the metropolitan area. So again, yes, indeed, an individual mayor may have a problem, but the problem is at the housing market level, the metropolitan area level. And we need to allow the development. And I know the planners have long been concerned about sprawl, as if sprawl is the biggest thing we need to avoid. I would argue that poverty is a hell of a lot worse than sprawl.
I would just add to that a little bit. One, there is enormous opportunity to build housing in our cities without going into the last middle-class neighborhoods. If you go into a middle-class neighborhood and say, you're now going to have to be dense, and people just say, well, okay, I'm going to go someplace where, I moved into a single family neighborhood because that's what I wanted. And that's what I paid for. That's what I was assuming, not discriminating against anyone. If I look at my own neighborhood here in Orange County, it's increasingly Latin and particularly Asian. Nobody I don't think is banning people. They would have banned me 20, maybe 30 years ago, but that doesn't happen anymore. So the bottom line is, I think that there is enormous opportunities to build housing. We're going to have a tsunami of underused office and retail space where we could recreate a huge new housing market in a place that doesn't affect somebody's neighborhood, already has the infrastructure for electrical and water, already has parking, is on a major street. There are lots that we could do with that. And then there are, I can tell you, I could take you to parts of Los Angeles in the southern end of LA, which are like the great open spaces. Even more so if you go to the south side of Chicago, where Wendell and I were with our colleague Pete Saunders. It was I mean, you were wondering what, the pheasants were coming back. I mean, there's enormous opportunity with what we have. And what you see is the real estate speculators, sometimes they want to go into nice middle class, working class neighborhoods that have been stable for years and ruin them, but they don't want to go into the areas where you could do the development more affordably, without disrupting things. We have to understand that the middle class in our cities and the stable working class communities are really beleaguered now. They're really having a very hard time, and I can't see why we would want to go and break those neighborhoods up when we have so many opportunities, A, in the periphery, of course, but B, within the inner cities and even in suburbs where there are going to be malls that are going to be half empty. There's lots we could do with it. We were once such an innovative and creative country in addressing these kind of problems. I'd like us to get back to doing that.
Mm. Yeah, one thing I've written about recently is just the changing nature of inequality in cities over the last generation. And it was a really interesting study from the New York Fed last year that looks at the most unequal cities in 1980 compared to today, right? And when you look back to 1980, if you're looking at this as the gap between the 90th and 10th percentiles, that list from 1980 is dominated by southern cities. About half of the top 15 are cities in the South, relatively small metro areas. I think there's only two major metros defined as, with more than 1 million people. I think New Orleans and Orlando were on that list. But really, the list looks more like a legacy of having not fixed things from the civil rights era in the 19th. It looks like the diversity seems to be explained much more by race. When you fast forward to today, the most unequal cities are all the usual suspects, right? It's the San Jose metro area, it's San Francisco, it's New York, it's Chicago, it's Washington. And it seems like there's something about, right, the agglomeration of highly paid talent, highly educated people in these places that is quite a force. So if someone were to say, look, those forces are strong, and even though people might be leaving New York City or they might be leaving San Francisco right now, at the end of the day, what's the long-term prospect for these cities? If they might have a smaller population, but if they have a lot of highly educated people and they remain dominant in finance and tech or whatever, what's the problem? Is it even worth trying to make them friendlier to the middle class over time? Should we just care about other cities and kind of let the behemoths just find their way because in the end they're strong enough to survive? Or do you think there are going to be some negative consequences people aren't thinking?
I think the diminishing.
Yeah.
I was going to say the diminishing tax base, I think, is going to force them to start to look at it a different way moving forward. I mean, here, we're dealing with billions of dollars in unfunded healthcare debt, unfunded pension liabilities, deferred maintenance. I mean, they look at the tax base as a necessity to be able to continue to pay these things off. And so I think at some point, a lot of these cities that are doing this, that's pushing out business and residents, they're going to have to kind of come back to square one and look at a way to draw more people in. And the only way to do that, I believe, is fixing some of the issues that we mentioned today.
Mm. I just want to build on that a little bit. One of the big problems in cities now is when you have an upper class, a lot of that upper class is now working remotely. So, San Francisco, New York, I don't think you'll see the kind of concentrations of these high-end jobs. They'll still be there, and some of them will remain, but I think there'll be a lot less. But the big problem is sort of what Charles has gotten to, which is when you don't have a middle class, you don't have an aspirational working class, you get crazy politics. So San Francisco keeps passing, San Francisco is probably the most evolved example of what we're talking about, of a city that has expelled its middle class and many of its poor people, but has had an enormous increase in the wealth of a small group, but a significant group. Look at the politics of San Francisco. They keep passing new and ever more arcane legislation because there's nobody to stop it. You couldn't elect a Bob Lanier or a Rudy Giuliani or even a Michael Bloomberg or a middle of the road candidate like Dick Reardon here in Southern California. There just isn't the social base for that anymore. I mean, you think about who now is concentrating in these cities you're talking about. It's this upper class, mainly young, very often without children, who have a very different view of things, tend to be very ideologically to the left. Those people who are dependent on the government, including in many cases public employees, and a small rich class, which they don't care if the public schools stink because they don't send their kids to the public schools anyway. So if we don't have a middle and working class population in our cities, they will continue to get crazier. And if you want a great example of that, Portland. I really wonder what's happening to the business of missions to Portland by other cities. Is this the role model we want?
Well, and also I think that there's a bigger question, and that's what people are going to do. I mean, with COVID and the exit from the places like central New York and San Francisco and so on, the decline in the central business district seeming to be likely. What's real important is for people to have choices, because as much as it's important for Portland and Seattle and Denver and San Francisco to come to reality in terms of their crazy policies, even if they get the right leadership, it's not going to happen tomorrow. And so I really think the trend we're going to see in the coming years is a continuing exodus of people, especially out of the core of New York to Jersey and Connecticut and the upper Hudson Valley, similarly in Chicago and so on, and to a lot of the smaller metropolitan areas around the country, which, by the way, latest data over the last 5 years shows that for the first time in living memory, these places are getting the most domestic migration, and the least is going to the over millions. And that is even with places like DFW, Houston, and Atlanta and Charlotte doing very well.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our audience members just about the interest that planners have for light and heavy transit. How do you see that factoring in? So light rail, fixed rail, this kind of interest on the part of planners is how much of a market is there for that? What's the effect of that on cities' planning decisions?
Well, let me try to answer that. I was a 3-term member appointed by Tom Bradley to the Los Angeles County Transportation Commission and created and introduced the tax measure that started the rail program in 1980. The fact is, though, transit through all these years, during which time we built all sorts of systems like the WMATA metro system, the Atlanta MARTA system, through all those years, a lot of us, not me lately, but a lot of us in transit tried to sell transit as an alternative to the automobile. However, it's not. Regrettably, we now have data out of the University of Minnesota Accessibility Laboratory that basically says in no city of this country can you get to anywhere nearly as many jobs by transit as by car in 30 minutes. In New York, you can get to 6 times as many jobs by car in 30 minutes as by transit. In Los Angeles, it's about 30. And the basic problem is that we need to make mobility available to everyone. And there's nothing wrong with transit, but we need to recognize that there are very serious limits about what you can do with it. And there's no way we're going to go from, say, New York, where 3% of the jobs are accessible within 30 minutes, to 6%, we couldn't even afford it. So transit is a wonderful thing. We all love transit. I ride transit when I can. But the fact is, it is not an answer that makes any sense in the modern metropolitan area.
And I'd just like to add a couple of implications also going to your earlier question. I think that the inner cities that are walkable, or where you could drive to things, or you could eventually take a cab, or where your ride on transit is short, I think we'll do fine. Long term, there is nothing quite as exciting, and I know this is the way you are, Ryan, to living in Manhattan, being able to walk to things. It will come back. It won't come back as the center and the powerhouse that has been predicted. But young people, certain wealthy people, certainly certain artistic people, actually maybe they'll come even more because the prices will go down. Certainly Chicago has that possibility, probably the most beautiful downtown in the world. There are lots of, there's an option, but to understand, as Wendell points out, it is a option. It's one of your options. Long term, people are going to get around on autonomous vehicles. That's going to change a lot of things. They're going to own them, or they're going to be able to call them up. Even today, Uber and Lyft have changed how people get around. And once the pandemic is gone, I think they'll do even better. And of course, many people will go on transit. I think, I mean, on transit from home. So I think that we're going to see paradigm shifts. The areas that I think are going to have some of the hardest times are not going to be the Manhattans and brownstone Brooklyn. It's going to be the further out places where you're far from jobs, where it's not very walkable. Those areas I think are going to have a really rough time.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very well said. As a city dweller who doesn't have a car, and the rise of micromobility has also contributed to, I'm one of those data points on decreasing ridership in the metro system. And it certainly had its impact. I've also read a little bit about and heard from some developers, just the changing formulas, even for hotel construction in cities now. You used to have a formula for how many parking spaces you would have per room, and that ratio is just completely gone, flipped because of Uber and Lyft. It really has fundamentally changed the ecosystem. Hey, we have a question too, and I know we're running up against the end of our time here, but you kind of touched on this, so the question's pretty apt. The question is just whether the remote work environment that we've entered into will have any fundamental impact on metro areas going forward. After we get through this thing, do you think it will have a lasting impact on cities?
Well, I'll just throw out a couple quick things. Most surveys show that a significant portion of the people working at home want to keep working at home, whether they work 5 days a week at home, 3 days a week, whether they come in for a lunch to see their colleagues once a week. Basically, Stanford's research shows that we're going to go from about 6 to 7% at the end of this to about 20%. CBRE talks about a 15% drop in the number of people working in offices full time. Those are going to have enormous impacts on the real estate market. I think there are going to be other hybrid environments. Like a friend of mine in Houston is actually going into the suburbs and buying old retail spaces and turning them into socially distanced offices. So for instance, if you have 30 people who live in Riverside but work downtown here in California, maybe you have some form of a system where people can go and work at a more localized environment. I think that would work very well, but I think that this shift will continue. It's been continuing for years. Wendell?
Yeah, beyond that, one of the big things that's already going on is people are moving out of the denser areas. And one of the big reasons they're moving out is because they really don't like the lockdowns and how inconvenient it makes life. Well, you know what? This isn't going to be the last pandemic. And anybody that assumes that once we reopen New York, maybe in a year or two, it's going to reopen for good, it may only reopen for 5 years. Let me tell you, it is a whole lot more comfortable to live in Bergen County or in Pike County, clear over in Pennsylvania, which is in the metropolitan area, with the threat of lockdowns than it might be in New York, now in the city. Now, granted, living in the city is great for young people and so on, but a lot of people aren't going to want to do that. And that's why a lot of the survey data that's being taken is showing that the people that are moving out of New York, and Manhattan Institute did a FOIA request at the post office and found out that there have been 300,000 changes of address from New York City to other parts of the country, and that the majority of them were on the Upper East Side, or a large part of them were on the Upper East Side. The fact is that we're going to see probably more of this, that's how the market is going to sort of change how we live because of all of this.
I'd just like to say, as someone born and raised in Bergen County, thank you, Wendell. I appreciate it.
Well, I know we're up against the end of our time here. One thing we haven't talked at all about is schools, and we can't do that topic justice here, but we did have a late breaking question about the impact of school choice reform on cities. And I wondered if any of you want to just give some closing words, knowing that we've got about 30 seconds.
Okay, I'm going to talk. I'm now going back to my Brooklyn identity. I'll talk really quickly. Basically, the school reform, which I had great hope for in New York, President Obama was a good supporter of it. Mayor Villaraigosa in Los Angeles. This is all being reversed. And one of my biggest fears with the Biden administration, given their ties to the teachers' unions, is that there will be attempts to undermine charter schools. And I have my older daughters in the charter school, which is a great school, a public charter. So I think that cities are sort of killing themselves. And again, because there's a lack of families and a lack of middle and upwardly mobile working class people to push education reform, I think it seems to be going to the wayside. And
Yeah.
I don't see how you keep the middle class in cities without good schools.
Well, those are good final words. The school issue is obviously a huge one. We'll have to reschedule a time to talk more at length about that in the future. But for everyone who tuned in, thanks for spending a part of your morning with us. And Charles, Wendell, Joel, thank you so much for your good work here today. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone back at one of our upcoming events on Cities Post 2020. Thanks, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.